Lesson 2.2, Independent and Dependent Variables. In order to understand what an independent and dependent variable is, first we need to define a variable. A variable is a symbol or letter used to represent an unknown value or number. It's called a variable because the value for that letter can change or vary. The word variable means to vary. The same symbol or letter can be used in many situations and can have infinite values. For example, the letter X is used very frequently in algebra, and the letter X can represent any number depending on the scenario. For example, what type of equation you're using at that time. A constant, unlike a variable, is a constant is a number, and there is no letter or symbol attached. And the value does not change, or it's constant. So for example, if you have an equation that has plus 3, the 3 in that equation is the constant, and the 3 is always a 3. It doesn't change. Independent and dependent. Independent is defined as not requiring or relying on something else. So the independent is it doesn't require or rely on any other factors in the situation. It's independent. It's on its own. And the dependent is defined as decided on or controlled by something else. So in a mathematical situation, dependent requires the other factors that are occurring in the situation before that value is determined. Independent versus dependent variables. The dependent variable is the value that is based upon the selection of the other value. So this is the value that requires the other value in order to be determined. And the independent variable is the value that can be changed arbitrarily, and this one controls or creates the other value. So the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. So if we are buying grapes, the dependent variable is the total cost of the grapes being purchased, and that is based on the price per pound for grapes, which is the independent variable. The dependent variable is generally the y value, and the independent variable is generally the x value. How we determine which is independent and which is dependent, we look at the two options presented and we see which value will, when changed, will cause a change in the other value. So for example, in our grapes scenario, the value that changes is the number of pounds that you buy, and that causes a change in the total cost of the grapes. Sometimes it's difficult because both values change, but one value directly causes the change in the other. So while you may say, oh, well, I'm going to buy $10 worth of grapes, and that would determine how many pounds you were buying, it's the number of pounds you were buying that causes the price. Okay, so we're going to identify independent and dependent variables. So we're going to look at some scenarios, and we're going to say which is the dependent and which is the independent variable. Okay, so we watch the weather report to determine if we should take our umbrella. Which one of these things would cause the other? Well, watching the weather report would make the decision for you as to whether you took your umbrella or not. So the weather report would be the independent variable. This will be arbitrary. We cannot control the weather. The weather is just whatever it is. However, we can control whether or not we take our umbrella. That is the dependent variable, and whether we take our umbrella depends on whether or not the weather report suggests that we should. Making sweet tea for a large gathering and measuring the amount of sugar you'll need. Well, let's see. Does the amount of sugar determine the amount of tea, or does the amount of tea determine the amount of sugar? The amount of T determines the amount of sugar. So our T is going to be our independent variable. And the amount of sugar will depend on how much tea we decide to make or need to make. The total price for apples bought at a grocery store that cost $1.50 per pound. Now what is going to change here, or what can we change, is the number of pounds we buy, and that will affect the total price. So the number of pounds is the independent variable. We can choose that, however many pounds we want to buy. We can buy 1, we can buy 15. And then the total price will depend on that, how many pounds we bought. So this will be the dependent variable. The amount of gas used on a road trip for some number of miles, some random X number of miles. Well, while you could argue that the amount of gas you have in your car determines how many miles you can go, you could argue that, but really the amount of miles you want to go determines how much gas you'll need. So the miles will be our independent variable. If we're just making a trip up to the corner store, we will use less gas than if we take a road trip across country. So the number of miles is the independent, the amount of gas used is the dependent. And finally, we have the amount of quarters you need to do your laundry at the laundromat. This one's also a little, maybe you have to think about it. What will determine which? We're going to do our laundry and we're going to need quarters. So if you think about that, the amount of laundry you have will depend or will cause the amount of quarters you need. If you only have 1 load, you need less quarters than if you have 10 loads. So the independent variable is the amount of laundry. The amount of quarters is the dependent variable. Now you'll notice in our first couple of examples, it went independent, dependent, independent, dependent, but then it switched and it went dependent, independent. So the location in the sentence does not have any bearing on which is the independent and which is the dependent. Okay, so just be sure when you're looking at independent and dependent variables that you approach it from trying to determine which one requires the other information in order to find the value.